they were German citizens first and foremost, could have equally described the anti-Semitism happening in Melbourne at this time. Questioning myself, I wondered, even with the benefit of historic hindsight, was I in fact doing precisely what my great-grandparents and grandparents did? Assume this would not land on my doorstep. I looked into the mirror of the past, but I chose not to see the image that reflected the future. I had always thought, when reading articles and watching displays on anti-Semitism on the news, that we as Australians, with Judaism as our religion, were protected by the law. Seems I could be wrong. The laws in place don't stop neo-Nazis marching down Spring Street, with the Victorian police standing silently at the curb, ready to protect Nazis from any opposing protesters. It took 5 long years for the recently passed law prohibiting the display of swastika in Victoria to be legislated. The current debate to not allow the Nazi salute in public is about to be tested. I confess to being sceptical as to an acceptable outcome. The recent statement by the Prime Minister and opposition leader deploring anti-Semitism as being unacceptable and un-Australian and will not be tolerated. What does this actually mean in real terms right now? Federal Labor MP Josh Burns wrote on social media, "It makes no sense that it's now illegal to display a Nazi symbol in Victoria, which is fundamentally a good thing, but you are still allowed to do what happened yesterday, which is to walk up and down Spring Street during the Sieg Heil and saluting neo-Nazi ideology." History shows us that we need to be very careful and call out this behaviour. Holocaust survivors have told me on countless occasions how fearful they become when they learn about or see acts of anti-Semitism, how they fear, not for themselves, but for their children, grandchildren and yes, great-grandchildren. Survivors know from their lived experience that anti-Semitism cannot be ignored. Their families paid the ultimate price in human lives lost. Survivors warn us that history could so easily repeat itself. Now we see how true and real this problem is. The very point of this gathering today is to allow us to have a full and frank discussion, to bring all our thoughts and ideas about anti-Semitism out into the open, to hear what our learned speakers have to share with us about possible new strategies and understandings to get the message across to not only those who lead and encourage anti-Semitic groups, but to connect with those who are inspired to join them. We know that Holocaust education plays a substantial role in combating racial vilification of Jewish students. But what about the rest of us, the Jewish community at large, who face anti-Semitism in the workplace, on the streets and on social media, to name but a few? We, who now get concerned if we don't see security guards watching out for terrorist behaviour outside our shul. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Paul Valent. Panelists are Gary Fabian, Lisa Lewis and Rabbi Gabi Kaltmann. Please welcome our guest speakers.
One second, Viv.
October 7th changed.
No, Viv. 2 seconds, wait.
October 7th changed everything? No? Thank you. We find once again our being Jewish leaves us vulnerable to personal and collective abuse just because of our religion. The cycle of media, short-term support, their long-term negative reproach weighs heavily on our ability to find a pathway out of our confusion and fears. Q&A is a chance for you, the members of our audience, to share your thoughts and ask questions of our speakers. Challenge us to do our share, to set aside our personal fears of anti-Semitism. Help us today, right now, to seek out answers to the difficult questions we need to address anti-Semitism, be it personally or aimed at community. Our first speaker today is Dr. Paul Valent. Welcome, Paul, to the stage. Paul is a founding member of the Child Survivors Organisation of Melbourne. He is one of the founders of the Australasian Psychiatrist Association, and a renowned traumatologist and a renowned international author. Please welcome Paul.
Thank you very much, Viv. I guess you can all hear me. Not very well. No. I'll try to speak up. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So, I was born in Hungary, and between the ages of 4 and 7, I experienced the Holocaust in Budapest. 9/10 of my peers were murdered. My parents and I also skirted with death, but unusually we survived by pretending to be Christians, and so for 3 years we simulated the general population. During that time I had much time to think while hiding in our apartment. At the age of 9 I started a book about violence and anti-Semitism because I didn't want it to happen again, and I didn't want others to experience it either. So it is almost 8 decades later now, but especially in the current environment, that I'm still grappling with this question. And what you'll hear is me grappling with this question. Serge Klaasfeld, who documented the Shoah in his film by the same name, warned, "Do not ask why," because he said such a question would make perpetrators appear human. But victims, no matter how well documented their suffering, cannot provide the answer to perpetratorhood. We must take the risk that perpetrators are actually human, and we have to ask why. The outline of what I'll cover is that, first of all, I'll try to define anti-Semitism. I'll describe how its different forms have been identified. I will describe my forays into understanding violence in different forms and show how fear underlies 3 types of violence. And these are the foundations for the different types of anti-Semitism as well. And lastly, I'll ask whether one can look beyond aggression and violence for happier modes of survival. So, definition of anti-Semitism. The term anti-Semitism was introduced by the German journalist Wilhelm Marr in 1879. He wanted to replace the crude term Judenhass, Jew hatred, with some kind of scientific respectability. That was the movement of the times. So he claimed, very scientifically, that Jews were a Semitic race inferior to the European Aryans. However, his change of words did not change the underlying Judenhass. So, he wrote in The Victory of Judaism over Germandom that no matter how civilized the German Jews appeared, they were actually racially and therefore irreconcilably, for the last 800 years, on a path to take over the world. And currently, at his time, they were on the brink of doing so. And resonating with Marr, in 1905, the Russian mystic Sergei Nilus wrote, "The great and the small, the coming of the Antichrist and the rule of Satan on earth." Sounds grandiose. And you'll be interested that the appendix to that grandiosity was Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which you've no doubt heard about. He claimed that the first Zionist Congress in 1897 actually consisted of a secret cabal of Jews, who planned to take over the world. The protocols myth of the elders of Zion is still central in Arab anti-Semitism and has been taught in Islamic schools such as those of Hamas. We have experienced over the years different forms of anti-Semitism, and I've tried to give them names, and then I've tried to put them into some kind of logic. Anyway, religious anti-Semitism. Antagonism to Jews was present already in antiquity. It was based on the exclusive nature of the monotheistic Jewish faith, the haughty sense of Jews being a chosen people, a refusal to intermarry and to accept converts, and also who had these strange customs such as circumcision, Sabbath observance, head covering, and mysterious diets. And these all marked out Jews as an exasperating, even odious foreign body. Christian anti-Semitism cohered around the 400 to 500s, and it held that the Christian church was really now the new people of God, the religion. Jews were accused of cohorting with or actually being the devil. In their rituals, it was said over the centuries that they ate the blood of killed Christian children, that Jews actually killed God because, after all, they crucified his son. And all this was the Catholic dogma until, you might guess, anyway, until the 1960s. There were many instances of Christian anti-Semitic persecution. Examples, for instance, during the Black Death in the 1300s, massacre of Spanish Jews in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Cossack massacres in Ukraine in the 1600s, and the various anti-Jewish pogroms in the Russian Empire between 1821 and 1906. Muslims too could not forgive Jews for not accepting Mohammed and Islam. And so they were punished until quite recently being dhimmis, so-called, and that meant that they were on the lowest rung of society. So that's religious anti-Semitism. Now, economic anti-Semitism. Excluded from farming and trades, Jews resorted to banking and money lending. And then they were accused of being incapable of honest labour, that they formed a financial cabal, again, seeking world domination through money this time. In reality, aristocracies diverted blame from economic and national turmoils onto the Jews, and they initiated pogroms and exclusions as ways to avoid paying to Jews their debts and, in the meantime, seizing Jewish property. Political anti-Semitism? There's all kinds. Right-wing anti-Semitism reverberates with neo-Nazi views of Jews as really only being faux white, really foreign interlopers who want to take over the world. And Jews will not replace us is the current catch cry, meaning that actually it's Jews who import all these Arabs, funny enough, and they're going to so dilute the white race that they will be eliminated. So the Jews are getting rid of the whites. Left-wing anti-Semitism, on the other hand, accuses Jews and Israel of being capitalist, oppressive, and colonialist, and it sympathises with the Palestinian underdog. Both of those practice Holocaust denial, and this is especially painful as this major Jewish hurt is minimised, ignored, denied, and turned on its head by accusations that actually the Jews are the new Nazis. The Muslim political view is that Israel and Jews are and they're often conflated, by the way, in Muslim literature. Well, they are conflated in their view because, after all, Israel is said to be part of a Jewish world domination. It is construed to be an evil apartheid state, ethnically cleansing the Arabs in the 1948 Nakba, and currently by settler colonialists in the West Bank. Postmodernism, deconstruction, identity politics, and social media all have a moral calculus which is somewhat crude. It says, Israelis and Jews are powerful and successful, therefore they are bad. Hamas is weak and people of colour, so they are good. It doesn't matter that most Israelis are also people of colour, so it's not particularly logical. Who you are is what's important, and that's identity politics. And that has replaced ideas. Denunciation has replaced debate. Public shaming has replaced persuasion. Disadvantage and suffering of your group replaced hard work and accomplishments. And accomplishments and wealth, after all, are unearned privilege. And this is prevalent in universities and places of learning. And so you see that intelligence doesn't have all that much to do with these different forms of anti-Semitism. Anyway, the different types of anti-Semitism are interchangeable and are chosen according to circumstances and current ideologies. So, you might think that we are an exceptional group, which in a way we are, but I'll say a little bit about it later. And we might think that actually we are exceptional scapegoats. And we say, look, okay, maybe Jews and Israelis have imperfections, but why, of all the peoples, why the Jews? Why Israel? I mean, just look, as an example, Jordan, right next door, that state killed 20,000 Palestinians during Black September in 1970. Whoever hears about that. So, we are at a crossroads. We can declare that we have been destined to be special, yes, especially destined to suffer, and while being the conscience of the world, Or we may consider anti-Semitism to demonstrate something of human qualities that are more general, whose origins we do not fully understand, but understanding it could shed a light on the many hatreds around the world, including anti-Semitism. And that's the view that I favour. You will now find a kind of change of tone in what follows. And if this sounds rather cold and logical, believe me that I am, like we all are, also overwhelmed by emotions, fear, anger, outrage. But to win this battle, we must understand the enemy as well as ourselves. And understanding requires a different, this somewhat cold and analytic type thinking, so bear with me. First of all, we are not the only victims. There have been the American Indians, the Armenian, Cambodian, Rwandan, and arguably the Australian Aborigine genocides. And prejudice and oppression are even more universal. Emancipation of slaves is only recent. Emancipation of women is still ongoing. Children were killed in Roman times if the father so decreed, and children have been dominated and exploited and ignored till current times. So anti-Semitism is really one example of widespread and different persecutions of, well, weaker people. Now, on the other hand, let me remind you that people love their children. They can be generous to each other to the point of sacrifice. They can cooperate and form melting pots of cultures and ideas. So there must be reasons why sometimes people kill and abuse each other, and at other times nurture and sacrifice themselves for others. So let's remember that, while now we will look at the dark side. So far we have been looking at macroscopic human waves of behaviour, but perhaps microscopic perspectives may also be useful. I will pass by individuals like Hitler and Stalin, severely traumatized as they were in their early lives. You can read about them. Here's a little advertisement in Heart of Violence, which you can buy over there. But here, I want to tell you more about more ordinary perpetrators who I have encountered. I have encountered them in my professional experience over the last, over 30 years, working in private and working in an emergency department of a hospital. One of my first experiences in hospital psychiatry was being asked to deal with violent patients locked in isolation wards. They were certified as psychiatrically ill, but the nurses who looked after them were very, very disturbed because these patients were screaming and threatening, and they were scared of them. And to cut a long story short, I was also scared of them when I approached and heard them screaming and threatening and banging. But I sort of had this inspiration, and I asked them through the door, what is it that they're upset about? And they said, well, we don't have any toilet facilities, and we're going to wet and soil ourselves. And so what happened was that I negotiated with the nurses and the patients that they might go to the toilet and return to the locked ward afterwards. And lo and behold, quiet reigned. And this kind of interaction wasn't uncommon. Many patients in the emergency department were quite aggressive when they believed that their relatives' life-threatening symptoms were ignored. From the nurses' point of view, they were classified as urgent or not urgent, but the patients didn't know that. They thought that they were dying, and the nurses were telling them to just shut up and wait their turn, which to them meant wait until you die and have a look at you. So there were reasons, it seemed, why people could be aggressive. As a patient of mine, I saw in my rooms threw his second child against the wall, a baby. He was enraged at the time because his father had loaned his elder brother a sum of money, which on request by him to his father for the same sum, the father had denied. The father acknowledged that he did favour his older son and that actually he had never wanted another child. Talking it over with my patient, we realised that he actually had to adjust to the fact that he was an adult, not a child wanting and fighting for his father's attention, that actually he would never get it, and that he had to grieve that. And when he did come to love his second child. And so, the more that I examined angry and violent patients, ranging from those irritated for having to wait in the waiting room and casualty, to actually murderers, the more I realized that they all saw themselves as victims and in danger of their lives. So I'll tell you about a horrific murderer, for instance, who killed father and son. But I visited him in then Pentridge, and I found this really nice, classic, friendly Italian guy. But what he had done was that he killed his manager, the manager in his business, and his son. And the reason he did that is because in his mind, the manager, well, not in his mind, but in fact, the manager was siphoning money from his business, putting him down, acting as if he owned the business, and in fact, being a threat to the murderous financial state, driving him to near bankruptcy by now. And at that stage, he went into another state of mind. And in that state of mind, he relived how in his childhood, his stepfather, who persecuted and took all his money, felled his mother, and he thought that he killed her, and he had really hated him and wanted to kill this man. Instead, he immigrated to Australia. But now, this current employee and this stepfather merged. And now there was no choice in his mind, because it was a kill or be killed situation, and he killed the man and his son. In each case of unwarranted, what's to us would seem unwarranted violence, was an underlying factor, and I found that was fear. Fear of having to wet and soil oneself, fear of one's existential crisis being ignored, fear of something that threatened to be repeated, something what we would call PTSD. Now, staff awareness of these dynamics in the emergency department, where the major complaint was that we don't know what's coming in the door, we don't feel safe because people can be violent and we might be hurt, disappeared. That view disappeared because they learned that the moment there's an agitation, you ask, hey, why are you agitated? And then you deal with it, and then it disappears. So there was no violence for decades in my department, in emergency department. So I think that there are three ubiquitous survival fears. The fear of annihilation, fear of being overtaken, like a competitive one where you're put down and humiliated, and fear that you will lose essential resources. And these fears may be immediate and possibly misinterpreted, as they sometimes were in the emergency department, or they may trigger post-traumatic events like in that murderer case, or both. So, for instance, current Palestinian demonstrations in Melbourne trigger Holocaust fears, and some people really feel that, it's like the Holocaust. But on the other hand, seeing Israeli soldiers in Palestine can trigger fears of the Nakba and of past persecutions. So there are fears, and the fears may be misunderstood, misperceived, or returned in a traumatic form. So let me now come back to the social kind of anti-Semitism, understanding that there are these three different kinds of fears. So let's have a look at the fear of annihilation and how that expresses itself. So in this case, Jews are hated because they are seen as killers. They are murderous infiltrators who sacrifice, as we said, Christian babies for Passover. They poison the wells of Europe. And as Hitler said, well, they are the germs and parasites who infect the world with diseases, according to him, like syphilis. As far as the genocide of the Palestinians, so-called, well, they want to genocide the whites in Europe by flooding them with aliens. They will not be placed, as we said. Jews are Christ killers in league with the devil, and therefore one can torture and kill them with pure hearts. Jews are also seen as an existential threat to the Arab world. Therefore they must be killed according to Article 7 of the Hamas Covenant. The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing them. And when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees, the stones and trees will say, "O Muslims, O Abdullah, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him." So in this view, it's a matter of kill or be killed. Therefore Jews should be killed. The fear of being overtaken or squeezed out. This is because, according to this view, Jews rule the world. Of the recent massacre, you might ask, why kill babies? Well, he's a colonizer first, and the baby second. The woman raped to death, oh shame, it had to come to that, but she is a white oppressor. And this modern trope reflects the protocols of the Elders of Zion, where the Jews rule or about to rule the world at the cost of the Aryan race, or in this case the Muslim world. And the hierarchy of oppression and killing has to be reversed. And this is what Leon Trotsky in 1905 said, describing a pogrom. So what happens when you do kill the Jews? Well then, according to Trotsky, the Dosshouse tramp is king, a trembling slave in Arago, hounded by police and starvation. He now feels himself an unlimited despot. Everything is allowed to him. He's capable of anything. He's the master of property and honour, of life and death. If he wants to, he can throw an old woman out of a third-floor window, together with her grand piano. He can smash a chair against the baby's head, rape a little girl, while the entire crowd just looks on. God save the Tsar. That was then, and now, Allahu Akbar, on October the 7th. But wait, there is another part of the story. In the Arab Spring, only a decade ago, practically every Arab nation rose up against their corrupt, exploitative, undemocratic leaders. They have all been, almost all and almost totally, have been put down by heavy military actions. The multiple uprisings and protest movements in Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, Lebanon and Egypt have been seen as still confirming the ideas, the desires of the Arab Spring. So the question of who oppresses who is a little unclear now. I mean, was it the Palestinian problem, a welcome diversion for Arab oppression? Was it the evoking fears of centuries of oppression by Europeans of Arabs? So, no, according to this trope, Jews rule the world, and it is they who should be put back in their place. And now for the third fear, that Jews own the world. That wealth consists of land, money, and the ability to make money. And historically, land was a source of food and security. Conquest of land increased that wealth. Conquest of the people who inhabited the land, making them slaves, increased wealth even further. So possession was life, dispossession was death. But what did the Jews do? Dispossessed of land, dispossessed of the possibility of conquest and of professions, they came to rely on one thing that they were allowed to do, and that was money, and on what enhanced making money, which was commerce and education and mutual help. Sometimes their capacities were utilised by the landowners. At other times their capacities were envied and restricted. And sometimes there were cycles of allowing the Jews to prosper and then later to rob them and to kick them. Since the Holocaust, there is a return of relative Jewish prosperity. The proportion of Jewish billionaires and Nobel Prize winners is out of proportion to the Jewish numbers. The same applies to doctors, businessmen, writers, artists and politicians. And the same applies to Israel, which has worked itself up to a relative degree of prosperity. But when times are tough, and the have-nots do not have the wealth, and they do not have the education, or they do not have satisfying lives, they may turn on Jews who have them. Of course, they say, Jews and Israel are not victims. They are the colonizers and exploiters. Look at their wealth and the trophies. Jews have it all. They must have stolen it. Let's take it back. Beyond anti-Semitic forms of expression and beyond the fears that I mentioned, there is, we feel, something other. There is an irrationality. And whether we are confronted by illogical imams or bloodthirsty Hamas, or by the far right or the far left, or all kinds of illusions, the Trump phenomenon, the post-truthness at universities, there's some kind of irrationality. And I'd like to address that a little bit. And there's something that is a recent invention, thank goodness, and that is that we have discovered something about our brains that we didn't know before. And it's an amazing phenomenon because it's only recent. And I remember as a student I asked in anatomy when we dissected the brain, well, what is the function of this right hemisphere? And I was told nothing much, a bit of emotion maybe, but it's redundant. Well, now we know that it's not. Let us compare it to something which we understand. And that is that in our voluntary nervous system, our will, so we feel that our will is what controls our external muscles, which will move as we wish. But there's an involuntary nervous system which innervates our hidden, vital organs, over which we have little knowledge and control inside. We don't see it. The right hemisphere of the brain is like this involuntary nervous system of the body. It regulates our vital, hidden, unaware mental strategies of survival. But these strategies are like instincts that we share with animals. We don't think about them, we don't really see them. They are fast, and we may only become aware of them after we have enacted them. It's like the involuntary nervous system. It is hidden, except for the emotions and sensations which we may experience. But it's very different to this left hemisphere, which is verbal, and it can orientate and think and apparently reason. The right hemisphere is non-verbal, no words, it can't think, it has no sense of time. It can confuse places and person. So, so the current Jews, according to the right hemisphere thinking, can be the same Jews who killed Christ 2,000 years ago. it's to this right hemisphere, it's totally logical, you know. And there are many other such tropes. But there's a neurological understanding of such things now. The right hemisphere is dominant up to the age of 7, and when a person is also reliving their traumas, that's when the right hemisphere is dominant. If you want to know how the right hemisphere works, think of dreams, think of hypnosis, think of children's fairy tales, think of Hitler and Trump, and the current Arabian fairy tales. Think also of PTSD and traumatic nightmares, where trauma is lodged in this right hemisphere, and it is often triggered by cues similar to the original trauma, like in this man that I mentioned. But the trauma recurs now in real life, now, unthinkingly and timelessly in its original form. So the Hamas massacre triggers for us, for us, the Holocaust. Israeli responses trigger for Arab, their Nekba, and also their past tyrants. It is said that anti-Semitism is but a canary in the mine. Behind it lie real problems, like the Tsar's oppressions, like the aristocracy's lavishness, while the people starved. Today's increasing anti-Semitism may similarly hide increasing individual and social insecurity at the same time as our current aristocrats, the increasing number of billionaires who pay no taxes and parade their planes and rocket ships thrive. So let's try to get back to something a little bit less dark. Because we have inventions and people live longer, and there are actually possibilities that real problems are solvable. There is enough food in the world for everybody, in fact. The resources are there both for Israelis and Palestinians, and they can survive and thrive better than when they first entered their conflicts. It may be possible for the two sides to become aware of their own and each other's traumas, this understanding where they come from, understanding their current enslavement to their pasts, and able to go beyond it with proper leadership and understanding into forging a different and a better future. They may come to understand that they were both oppressed people, and even still now, both are despised and unwanted. Yet both have striven through education and trade, as it happens. We nearly agreed to have a two-state solution in the past, but there are possibilities that we don't know yet, which a creative environment may lead to new kinds of agreements and controlling unwanted myths. To do that, both need to feel that the other will not want to exterminate them, enslave them, or humiliate them. These are the three fears. Instead, the other means of survival, which I mentioned a long time ago, the better ones, the better side of our natures, to grieve the past, adapt to it, sharing our humanity, resources, and respect. This, of course, may sound utopian, especially currently. But after Gaza, what is the alternative other than that? So to summarize, anti-Semitism is a stress and trauma situation for Jews, but it is also a stress and trauma manifestation of the perpetrators, of the other side. A resolution by old means that involved ever more traumatizing the other has not worked. There are better solutions if we can divest images from the past traumas projected on each other, and under new leaders and ways of thought, acknowledge each other's humanity. Is there any other solution?
Our next speaker is Fabian OAM. Gary is one that goes backwards and forwards to Germany to educate German children, and he's received the highest order that the German government can bestow, and he's a child survivor of the Holocaust. Please welcome Gary.
Thank you, Viv. My name is Gary Fabian. I was born in Germany in 1934, in Stuttgart. Just to give you a little bit of a link of the family connection with Germany. On my late mother's side, we've traced them back to the late 1200s, and on my father's side, we've traced them back to about the mid-1500s. Anyway, I was born in Stuttgart in 1934, which wasn't exactly the most convenient time for little Jewish children to arrive. In 1936, seeing what was going on, my family left and went to the Czech Republic. And they went to the German enclave Sudetenland. And then, of course, 1938, when Sudetenland was ceded by everybody except the Czech government or the Germans, it was time to sort of move on. We finished up in Prague, and in 1942 we were sent off to Theresienstadt. We were sort of minority who survived it till the end of the war, and just those who were into numbers. In the 4 years Theresienstadt was operating, some 15,000 children under 14 went through, and at the end of the war, and the figures are a little bit sort of rubbery, some figures say 120, some say 150 kids survived, so fairly long odds. Anyway, what I sort of wanted to discuss today was the re-emerging anti-Semitism in Germany. Having travelled to Germany quite a few times over the last 4 decades, and particularly the last 10 years, as a Holocaust survivor, I have observed the emergence of sort of right-wing forces and other things that have been going on, that and in the last 4 or 5 years, that a number of the ultra-right-wing sort of people have been elected to state and federal government, which really raises spectrum. While on my visits, I have rarely observed any personal anti-Semitism, but I was basically isolated to meeting with people who still further do things and sort of associated with liberal groups and those who try and sort of explain the Holocaust and all that sort of thing. That the sort of thing is, I mean, my perspective, sort of my personal one and a little wider one. Now, to give you an idea, some of these groups that I've sort of been invited with and associated, they sort of very much, there's one particular place near Stuttgart, it's a small town of about 15,000 people who sort of specialise in looking after immigrants, and they're very active in this. In fact, when I was there last year, I was invited to come on a panel that discussed sort of how you fare when you come into a strange country. And interestingly, the panel, beside myself, was someone from Kosovo, Syria and the Ukraine. And you get these different things. Now, but on a wider scale, that while governments and sort of groups still put up monuments, they have seminars, they have meetings. In fact, I was in Germany with my 2 daughters, Vicky and Carol, last year, and the occasion was I was invited. There was a very large commemoration of 80 years since a very large transfer of Jewish citizens from Stuttgart went to Theresienstadt. And that, as I said, this is all part of some sections of Germany saying, oh, we must remember we've got to do all these things. But generally, what I've observed, that most of the sort of, particularly the third generation German is saying, look, you know, this is sort of ancient history, let's draw a line, let's move on. So, and generally, Germany is a very strange sort of amalgam. Those in the West tend to be more sort of, you know, sympathetic. The old East Germany, there is a far greater sort of a movement away from remembering and all that sort of thing. There's other things that, I mean, there's always been, and unfortunately will always be, people in Germany attracted to the old Nazi ideology. These people still admire Hitler, the SS, and the Nazi regime and all the good, marvelous things that happened there. This includes some of these weird theories, something like the conspiracies of all kinds, and the idea of the Jewish world order. You know, there's some sort of sections that blame COVID on Bill Gates and the Jews. I don't know why the two are combined. But there's sort of a strange thing. The thing is, in Germany, you don't see any anti-Semitic graffiti, because that is strictly against the law in Germany, and it's very strongly reinforced. But just to offset that, there was an article 2 weeks ago in the paper. Oops. Now, this is an official release from the state security in Germany, who are very, very concerned on the sort of rising numbers of anti-Semitic crimes. And they're very concerned that not only are the thing happening, but I think that more their concern is that their very rather rigid laws are being broken. And they sort of have a very strange attitude. On the one hand, that they cry all this, but how much actual action they're taking against it, I think that's sort of a very grey area, because the other side of it, and some of the other anti-Semitism in Germany, also the rest of Europe, is there's a very large Islamic community over the years. And they're trying to sort of, and they, of course, they're pro-Palestine, and that's sort of hidden anti-Semitism, and particularly the new right-wing people in Parliament are very, very wary, whether it's sort of self-interest, whether it's sort of other, to not offend this growing Islamic community. So they tend to downgrade some of these anti-Semitic outbursts from the Islamic group, but they're also under pressure. So in the right wing, now this is rather ironic, because these ultra-right wings are obviously anti-Semitic and they're anti-Islamic, but the very fact that the Islamists are anti-Semitic, they sort of have a common thing, but they don't want to acknowledge it. I've had a few conversations with a number of people while I was over there, and they sort of feel, well, the Islamics are a growing majority. We really need to be careful not to offend them by being too stringent when sort of particularly Israel and the Jews are sort of mentioned. Of course, since I put this together about 2 months ago, the goalposts have shifted quite dramatically on these things. Now, I've got some figures here that the statistics say there were, before COVID, there were about 4% of the population who are very, very not only anti-Semitic, but anti-foreigners. And after COVID, the figure was, the old Nazis went up to 6%. Now, I haven't got the sort of hard figures, but I'm quite confident that over the last 2 months, these figures have increased quite dramatically. The other sort of, now of course, with the rise of right-wing parties in other nearby countries like Hungary and Poland, and what happened at the weekend, and this is out of today's, oops. Now, we've probably all read this, a very right-wing figure sort of won majority in the Netherlands. And I'm sure this will bleed over to the right-wing elements of Germany. So, as once again, and of course the other place that is fairly, the great war always has been, is France. We were on our trip to Germany, went to France for a week, and we're in Lyon. And there in the main street, there's a number of placards, Free Palestine, there's swastikas on lampposts all down the main street. But France all over. But now France, if you remember last week, there's a huge protest march against anti-Semitism. But I had a little note from someone in France that, well, the thing was led by the Prime Minister and the President. But the note I got from someone in France that the President was very, very reluctant to join this thing. It was only sort of pressure that he made an appearance. So once again, while we talk about Germany, all these right-wing things around Europe are sort of coming back into Germany, and the right-wing sort of element there obviously taking strength and encouragement from all this. So some of these things, some contradictory signals come out of Germany. When you look at the history of Germany over the last thousands of years, there's always been this anti-Semitism sort of breeding underneath, and there's a much deeper sort of thing that where it all started, but that's not for us to discuss. But as sort of things get more tense, this will no doubt raise its ugly head in a very, very short time. But on the positive now, there's always a positive side, and this is sort of a bit of a strange connection, that many young people believe in multiculturalism, that global problems can only be solved by international level understanding. They do not care too much about the German past, but believe things like the climate, the other things, the sort of approach to LGBT people, and a little bit of anti-Semitism all have a case. And while it seems a very strange amalgam of causes, they do tend to speak up about it. They have rallies, they have discussions, they have things. And although particularly some of the Islamic students tend to now in schools query when the lecturers talk about the Holocaust on that, they tend to be, and this of course is freedom of speech. But the very fact that the new generation is concerned with all these things, perhaps gives us a little bit of hope that there might be some tolerance in the new generation. But one can only agree. And the other, just a little quote. That's the trouble when you've got 2 minutes of paper. Now, and this is sort of, I think, look, the best way to overcome those who seek to silence us is to shout. To those who seek to kill us, to live. To those who seek to expel you, to come back. And to those who seek to divide the world on racial, ethnic and religious grounds, to reunite and live together for a better and better future. So that perhaps is a message for not only survivors, but all of us who are affected by this prejudice and hate. So perhaps that is just a brief summary how I see basically Germany and in wider Europe emerging in what is going on at the moment. Of course, as I said before, the last 2 months have really shifted the goalposts. And some of these elements who perhaps were a little bit reluctant to come out publicly have raised their ugly head and saying, well, it's all the Jews' fault. Of course, just in light of that, I mean, there's always this human bad times. But just before the war, there was this thing saying in Germany that all the troubles of the world are the fault of Jews and bicycle riders. Now, someone said, why bicycle riders? And the obvious answer is, why Jews?
We now welcome Lisa Lewis, volunteer coordinator for Courage to Care. And Lisa's got an extraordinary Holocaust family story herself. Please welcome Lisa.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we are gathered today and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I am truly honoured to be here today with Paul, whose book Child Survivors of the Holocaust I first read as a teenager, and with Gary, who is a long-standing Courage to Care volunteer, and of course Rabbi Gabi, whose art centre hosted our Courage to Care 30th birthday celebrations last year. It is also a privilege to be at the newly opened Melbourne Holocaust Museum, an extremely important and sacred place. I was absolutely delighted when Viv invited me to be part of today's panel in late September. But I must be honest that my thoughts immediately wandered to what I would be able to contribute to the discussion, given that I had not as yet had any real lived experience of anti-Semitism. Yes, I work for an organisation called Courage to Care, whose mission and purpose is to educate against all forms of hate. And I am a third-generation Holocaust survivor. But growing up in Melbourne, I had been blessed with the good fortune of not directly experiencing anti-Semitism. It is true that both my children attend Jewish day schools where armed security guards are the norm. Just recently, my 13-year-old daughter Kiara, who attends Mount Scopus College, was asked at an inter-school sport match whether she and her teammates go to the school with the guns. My husband Brett has been a CSG protector and parent protector at both Mount Scopus and King David schools for longer than I can remember. So I guess you could say that the threat of anti-Semitism has always hovered over my life. But actual acts of anti-Semitism occurred in faraway cities like Paris, Copenhagen and Philadelphia, not in accepting and inclusive Melbourne, Australia. My grandparents and great-grandparents experienced anti-Semitism in Europe, with both my grandmothers forced to flee Poland, one before the war in the 1930s and the other during the war in 1940. So anti-Semitism is something that was very real to me, but in a historical sense. My grandmother, Gusha Raskin, was born in Białystok, Poland in July 1926. Gusha lived with her parents, Fania and Leza, and younger sister Bella. Gusha had a very privileged upbringing, as Leza owned a large and successful electrical, radio and motorbike business. Gusha was 13 when the war broke out, and the family was forced to flee Białystok and became refugees in Vilna, Lithuania. My great-grandfather Leza was not a religious man, but his mother had passed a few months before the invasion of Poland, and one day, whilst attending shul in Vilna saying Kaddish, he fortuitously heard about a man named Chiuni Sugihara, a Japanese diplomat who served as vice-consul for the Japanese Empire in Kovno, Lithuania. Mr. Sugihara was prepared to provide visas to Jews desperately trying to escape persecution in Europe. As a result, Leza and my grandmother Gusha boarded a train to Kovno. They queued for hours outside Mr. Sugihara's office, and on the 3rd of August 1940 were successful in obtaining visas. These visas became known as visas for life. Guta and her family travelled from Kovno to Moscow and then on to Vladivostok on the Trans-Siberian Railway. From there, they travelled to Kobe, Japan, and boarded a Japanese vessel bound for Cape Town. However, they were not permitted to remain in Cape Town due to a South African government policy to disallow the settlement of Jewish refugees. The visa issued to the family by Mr. Sugihara was endorsed by the British consul for entry into southern Rhodesia, then a British colony. You see, Guta's father, Laser, had travelled to southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in 1938, as he was worried about the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Poland, and luckily obtained an entry visa for his family. On arrival in Cape Town, the family took a train to Bulawayo, southern Rhodesia, where they settled as stateless people. My grandmother's survivor and refugee experience had a sustained impact on her life, as well as on the lives of her children and grandchildren. She always made me finish all the soup in my bowl and all the food on my plate, with the promise of a mirror at the bottom, as she was terrified of her loved ones going hungry, as she had as a refugee in Japan. I remember my grandmother always being afraid of people in uniform, a fear which she passed down to my own father, Ellie. There is no doubt that the visa for life saved my grandmother and her family. Mr. Sugihara helped thousands of Jews flee Europe by issuing transit visas to them so that they could travel through Japanese territory, risking his job and the lives of his family. In 1985, the State of Israel honoured Mr. Sugihara as one of the righteous among the nations. It has been estimated that as many as 100,000 people are alive today as the descendants of the recipients of visas for life, including my family. Both my parents were born in Bulawayo and my sister and I were born in Cape Town, and we migrated to Melbourne as a family in 1992. The first element of the title of today's discussion on anti-Semitism is Mirror on the Past. And as you can hear, my experience with anti-Semitism for most of my life has been largely historical, part of my family's incredible journey from Poland to Africa and then Australia. I had the privilege, or so I thought, of being a Jewish person living a protected life in a constitutional democracy called Australia. But the heinous atrocities committed by Hamas terrorists against innocent Israeli civilians on October the 7th, followed by Israel's military incursion into Gaza, has seen anti-Semitism become front and centre in my reality. Just last week, in a message to Jewish communities in the diaspora, Israeli President Isaac Herzog said, "Around the world, in the wake of the massacres, we have seen a terrifying surge of anti-Semitism. And this fact has exposed the close link between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment. Heartbreakingly, this has been true in our own country too." The second part of our discussion topic for today, Reflections on Our Future, has for me taken on a whole new meaning in the wake of October the 7th, and has caused me, and those close to me, to grapple with the harsh realities of being a Jew in Australia in 2023 and beyond in ways I had never imagined. Since October the 7th, I have had to answer questions from my teenage daughters about why the world thinks it's okay for Jewish women to be raped. Me too, unless you are a Jew, right? Since October the 7th, I have wondered about the silence of some of my non-Jewish friends who I have supported in the past in challenging times in their own lives, but have fallen deathly silent. Since October the 7th, I have overheard my 15-year-old daughter Ebony on the phone to a friend, asking her if she had heard about the Jewish man who was attacked on his bicycle on Chapel Street, a place where the two girls love to go thrift shopping on the weekends. Since October the 7th, I have driven down Carlisle Street, confronted by the Port Phillip Council commissioned mural by Michael Porter of a hook-nosed Jew, the exact portrayal of Jews in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and by Nazi propagandist Julius Streicher. Also on Carlisle Street and in the CBD, the Star of David stickers placed on Jewish shops, encouraging the public to boycott Jewish businesses. And the graffiti on Newport Road in Clayton South, Jews live here, kill the Jews. Since October the 7th, I have been told by friends who are doctors at Melbourne hospitals that they are no longer being referred work because they are Jewish, that none of their non-Jewish colleagues have reached out to them, and that they are too scared to make any reference to the fact that they are Jewish to their patients. Sadly, I could go on and on. The incidences of anti-Semitism, including by our own federal parliamentarians, grows by the day. The last few weeks have showed that some of us, myself included, were lulled and maybe even deluded into a false sense of safety, a sense that whilst anti-Semitism of course still existed somewhere out there, it didn't pervade the bubble in which I thought I lived. Just this September, I visited Berlin, where I spent an emotional week trying to fathom how the Nazis were able to murder 6 million Jews. I visited the picturesque Wannsee, where the Nazis famously planned the final solution, and the memorial at Platform 17, located in Grunewald, which was and still is an expensive, leafy suburb, just like Armidale or Malvern, from where the Nazis deported over 10,000 Jews to concentration camps in plain view of the local residents. It was almost impossible to comprehend. But it wasn't until I returned to Melbourne a few days after October the 7th to the chants of "Gas the Jews" on the streets of Sydney that I finally understood how easily the Holocaust was able to occur. As Courage to Care volunteer and child survivor Peter Gaspar, who's here today, often says, the Holocaust didn't start with gas chambers and murders and executions. It started with stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination and hate speech. My mirror on the past has been shattered. Anti-Semitism for me now is a lived experience, no longer something historical. I have asked myself many times in the last 7 weeks whether there is any point in trying to combat this rabid anti-Semitism which is now on full display even in our own country. I don't know about you, but for me the despair is sometimes overwhelming. But this brings me to my involvement with an extraordinary organisation called Courage to Care. For over 30 years, Courage to Care has focused on educating students across Victoria through its Upstander programs. Our Upstander programs equip students with practical tools to stand up against all forms of prejudice, racism and discrimination, and empowers students to take positive actions in their schoolyard and communities. Holocaust survivors, like yourselves and their descendants, share their stories of acts of courage of ordinary people who intervened to save them. These powerful testimonies demonstrate to students that they too can be upstanders and that every individual has the power to make a positive difference by standing up in the face of injustice. I began today by telling you the story of my beloved grandmother's survival, which was only made possible by Mr. Sugihara, who had the courage to care. Given that story, I am sure that it is no surprise to you that I work for an organisation like Courage to Care, whose mission and purpose resonate so keenly with me due to my own family history. It was Viv's hope that the speakers today would be able to suggest possible new strategies in combating and dealing with anti-Semitism. I fear that I don't have anything new to offer, but I firmly believe that we cannot give up and that education, not just Holocaust education, but upstander education, which aims to transform behaviour, is essential and must be ongoing. I am very proud that since the 7th of October alone, more than 3,500 Victorian students have been directly engaged in upstander programs with Courage to Care. There is no doubt in my mind about the power of education and storytelling in our fight against anti-Semitism. I am aware that much of what I have said today is rather bleak, but as part of my conclusion, I would like to leave you with some words of hope for the future. Some words that keep me going on this never-ending quest for greater understanding and acceptance in our society. At the conclusion of each Courage to Care school program, we ask the students to provide their feedback. The feedback that I have chosen to share with you is from grade 6 students at St Peter's Primary School in Clayton. The students said, "The Courage to Care session taught us about being an upstander and about prejudice, discrimination, stereotyping and racism. We learned that being an upstander is to stand up for those who are going through rough times. They help to defend the victim from the perpetrator. During the stories of the Holocaust, we understood that those who had been the upstanders, that those people who had been the upstanders were the people who supported the Jews. We can all be upstanders by helping people when they are being judged and discriminated against. We learned a lot from the program and can now share our knowledge of doing the right thing when others aren't. Now we can all be upstanders. I am not naive. We have a long way to go, and our job educating the Australian community will likely never be done. It would not surprise me if future generations of Jewish Australians will meet to discuss the same issues we are discussing today. But I am hopeful that through continuing to place our emphasis on upstander education, that maybe, just maybe, one day in the future, my children's Jewish schools will no longer be known as the schools with the guns. Thank you.
Our last speaker today is, I call him my son, Rabbi Gabi Kaltmann. Gabi has a lot to do with education in school. He has seats on various boards. Please welcome Rabbi Gabi Kaltmann.
Thank you, Viv, and I want to acknowledge the incredible work that you have done to make this happen together with Lena and Dr. OAM. And thank you for everybody for joining us at this incredibly important event and panel. I want to take a moment with everybody here to also acknowledge the pain, the hurt, the anxiety and the fear that we as a community have been dealing with for the past 50 plus days. My phone has relentlessly been ringing with community members from all across Victoria wanting to talk about what is happening and to try and find a path forward, which for all of us has just been so incredibly painstaking and painful as we watch from 13,000 kilometres away what is happening to our brothers and sisters in Israel. The silver lining is coming, as we've seen over the past couple of days, but that for not just us, but also the young people, our youth, comes with increased fear and confusion, and it's up to every one of us to sort of work with them over the coming weeks and months as sadly the conflict drags on. For the past 50 plus days, anti-Semitism has been torrential. It's been a tsunami. It's up 1,500% against members of our community and community institutions. That is the most recent CSG statistics. We're feared, we're fearful, and we're scared. And we've been looking for answers. We've been looking for leadership. And part of the issue, I feel, from the feedback of the community is that we haven't had it. It hasn't come. Been looking around for not just leaders within our community, but for politicians. And part of the unrest and the unknown is, generally and usually it has come and we have felt that staunch support. And it hasn't come as fast or as much as we would have liked. Our students are feeling it on campus. A recent August survey before the 7th of October found that 2 out of 3 Jewish students have experienced anti-Semitism. Half of all Jewish students do not acknowledge that they are Jewish when asked on campus, or take off their kippah or Magen David, their Star of David necklace, to make sure that they are not easily identified as Jewish. As all the panelists have touched on. It's up across the world, and yes, there's a certain heightened sense of security within our community, extra CSG shifts, outside creches, and armed guards where they wouldn't usually be. What's interesting, and what I've been telling my community is that this is not unique to the Jewish people. It's unique to our time, and it's something that we never thought that we would experience. We thought this was from a bygone era. Experiencing the Yom Kippur War in 2023, as they're calling it, is something that we never dreamed would happen. Experiencing the same anti-Semitism that our grandparents experienced, and that uneasiness and fear is something that I never, and speaking to my parents and my community, thought that we would ever have to deal with. But throughout Jewish history, what's happened is, this has happened, exactly this. What's interesting is, when we've gone through these incredibly tough times, there has been a resurgence within Judaism. And I want to take you a bit on a journey through Jewish history, starting at the Babylonian exile, the destruction of the first temple. The Jewish people were dispersed. We went into Persia predominantly, and we had the famous story of Purim. We had leaders within the Jewish community, Mordechai and Esther, and yes, our rabbis wrapped it up, being miraculous, which it was, but ultimately had strong leadership, and they paved the way forward for us to return to Jerusalem, to return to Zion. Following that, the story of Hanukkah, yes, it wasn't easy, but we persevered. After the story of Hanukkah was the destruction of the second temple, where we were really sent into the diaspora. But what happened was, we had a resurgence and a huge development of Jewish thought and literature and practice. The times of the Talmud, the Mishnah. The rabbis got together and said, how are we going to save Judaism? We must move it from being strictly oral to start writing it down. Going along, we had the Crusades, but as they were happening, and there were pogroms, massacres and riots all through the Middle Ages. We had the likes of Rashi, of Shlomo Yitzhaki from Paris, from France, Worms to be exact, and the Rambam, Rabbi Moses, Maimonides, writing incredible literature and poetry that is championed and learnt to this very day. And so many more things happened as the development of Judaism when we were suppressed, when we were exiled, when we were downtrodden. And coming to the climax of it all, the Holocaust, 6 million of us were massacred and led to our deaths. 3 years later, in 1948, was the foundation state of Israel. Right now, it feels like we are in the middle of that movie. We are watching things as they transpire. And what I have seen is, yes, under this torrent of vitriol and hate speech and anti-Semitism, I have seen the community band together to find solace, camaraderie, and reclaim their Judaism. Just the other day, I had somebody come for Shabbos. They called up the Ark Center and they said, we are from Wood End and we are Jewish. You know, friends, I couldn't find Wood End even if you asked me on a map. But these stories are happening to me weekly with people coming out of the woodwork that I wouldn't even see necessarily on Yom Kippur. We're living right in the middle of this resurgence, this reclaiming of our Judaism, our heritage, our religion. People are doing it differently, but most of all, what are they reclaiming is their sense of identity. I'll end off with this. We are called B'nai Israel, and the state of Israel is called Israel. But ultimately, who was Israel? Israel was Jacob's second name. We're not called B'nai Avraham, the sons of Abraham, B'nai Sarah, the sons and daughters of Abraham, or Isaac. Why did we settle on Israel, Jacob's second name? And it's actually quite timely that we're doing this, and we're going through all these trials and tribulations, because the current Torah portion is when we receive it, when Jacob receives that name. And it comes from Jacob wrestling with the angel at night. And Jacob, see, crowd nodding. You don't need to come to my drush on Shabbos. Jacob and the angel, they wrestle. And I'll interpret that what was Jacob actually wrestling with? He was wrestling with his subconscious, like we all do at times. We all have those inner battles. Should we go here, go there? Did I do the right thing? Did I say the right thing? Jacob was in the middle of a conundrum, and whether he literally wrestled with the angel according to the text, or it was all internal, we can debate that another time. You can debate that with other rabbis. What Jacob was ultimately doing was he was struggling in his life. And ultimately, he struggled with God, and his belief, and the system that he was born into, and what his life had given him. But why was he renamed Israel? Because he wrestled with God, but ultimately he prevailed. You wrestled with God and you prevailed. And that, my friends, is the story of Jewish history. Sadly, we are beaten, we are massacred, we are attacked over the ages. And sadly, tragically, it's happening right now. But ultimately, we band together. We find that solace and community and camaraderie in our Jewish identity. And ultimately, we prevail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabby. So we have a little time now if anybody in the audience would like to address a question to any of our speakers. We have some microphones here if you'd like to just put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question or say something. There's a gentleman down here, yes? Thank you.
I'd like to address my question to Gabby Fabian. He mentioned in his talk of the rise of the right wing in the Netherlands, in Hungary, and Le Pen. I don't think you mentioned Marie Le Pen in France. And I believe they're all supportive of Israel, strong supporters of Israel. What is their relationship, and how accepted have they been by the local Jewish communities in those countries?
Well, look, there's different levels of that. When someone mentioned that none of their non-Jewish friends have had any contact with them, well, I've had a number of contacts who rang me, "Are you okay?" and all that, and also I am associated with some community organisations, and they've been very forthcoming. Now, look, you don't know how genuine they are, but there's a definite interest that when you're sort of in contact with people, they do take some notice. But look, it's one of those questions very hard to find a really realistic answer to.
Anybody else got a question?
Viv.
Could quickly add to that. You'll find that also there are some people that are confused as to what to do, and they want to reach out, but they don't know how. And eventually they take time for them to reach out. Some people have let us down ultimately, but from my network as well, most of them have reached out. Some of them did take time, and their excuse was that they weren't sure what was appropriate and whatnot.
nearly answered my question. I was going to ask you about the Muslim-Jewish get-together, whatever you would call it. Have you heard any more from them?
So ultimately, the community has felt let down by the Islamic community. I myself am quite involved in this multicultural and interfaith work. I don't need to remind everybody over here that there was over a week before, from October 7th to Israel going into Gaza, and we waited quite, impatiently for the Islamic community to reach out and console us, send words of strength and the like. And that didn't come, ultimately, to our disappointment. We can go into what the Jewish community does when there are, sadly, terrorist tragedy and other events that happen around the world to different minority communities, and I can only talk for myself, but ultimately we're the first to be there offering condolences, and we expected in this case that it would be quite obvious for them to do that. Sadly, that didn't happen, and relationships are not where they were, and if anything, they have broken down to a certain extent. And that's quite sad, because it is always good for dialogue, and to have dialogue that lowers the temperature within the community. Ultimately, we live in quite a multicultural state. They're our neighbours, we go to work, we see them, we see other people all the time. And when the leadership is there, sort of standing hand in hand and supporting different minority communities during their time of pain, that assists around the community. And to our disappointment, it didn't come, and that's something that the Jewish community leadership and the people that are involved in this work are trying to add up and will eventually work a way forward.
We have time for about another couple of questions, so we'll keep them quick, we'll get some more going. Thank you.
I wanted to thank each of the speakers for sharing with us such personal stories and giving us such wise messages that we can all apply in our own lives. For decades and really for generations, since the Holocaust, we've been saying never again. We can't let it happen again, we won't let it happen again. We've got to, as individuals and a community, we mustn't let it happen again. I was wondering if each of the speakers or whoever would like to can tell me if they agree with the statement I've been seeing around the place, never again is now. If not, why not? And if so, what can we do to make sure it never happens again? It doesn't happen this time.
I'm happy to go first. I think we've been saying for decades, never again, and then never again, basically. It happened on October 7th. Never again means a lot of things. That there should be another Holocaust, that Jews should be massacred, but I think it's a lot deeper this time because of the way our Israeli brothers and sisters were killed. And, for those of us that have read some of the articles and have watched some of the videos, I'm not going to go into it in detail right now, it's not the place, but ultimately that really brought home, it's never again, but one more time, because of the way they were massacred and killed. And as we're 50 days into it, and there are different campaigns around the world to bring awareness, and you touched on that, me too, unless you're a Jew, you know what I mean, and the thing that means. And I'm not going to, of course, be dancing around it because I don't want to re-traumatize people. And if you're not sure, what I do tell people is, don't go looking for these things. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, and it's not a mitzvah to watch these videos or read about it. But the crux of it, in my opinion, is these are the stories that we heard happen to our great uncles and our great aunts and our cousins and our great grandparents. We're, thank God, the sons and daughters, the grandchildren of survivors that survived all this, but this is how our great uncles, our uncles, aunts, that's how they went. And that's what never again means. The Jews will never be led to a slaughterhouse the way they once were. And sadly, October 7th is never again once more.
Any more questions?
Yes, I'm reminded of the fact that post-war in the 1940s, there was a lot of immigration here from Europe, and my particular aspect to that was that in 1947, in that late period, 45, 46 to 47, there was an embargo of Jewish immigrants to Australia. And one of the reasons was, according to a politician who did this, who said that, and that was that Australia does not want, I don't know how to express this, but they don't want people who are religious fanatics. They come here in their black overcoats, their pars, long beards, they look dirty, etc., etc. I don't want to say this. This is in Hansard, if you want to check it out. And there was no ships available between 40, 46, 47, 48. Later on, through various eminent people, Jewish people here, that was lifted. And we had a minister there called Corwell who helped in the immigration. Now, the reason I mention all this is that we, the Jewish people, have contributed so much. We have medical clinics, we have universities, we even have Sir John Monash, the Highlands universities. And I sort of don't see why people who are in high positions, I was in a position where I spoke out on the stage, but I don't see why our leaders here do not talk about that, why other rabbis do not openly talk about that and make it evident that the Jewish people have contributed so much. There wouldn't be, all sorts of aspects.
Sorry, Henry, we just need a quick question. Or
well, it's part of the discussion, and I don't know. I can only ask.
We've only got 5 minutes left.
Henry, just quickly before I'll hand over, do you want to say something on this? I think, we had a treasurer. The previous government, we had a Jewish treasurer. We've had Dr. Alan Finkel. There, over the past couple of years, we've had quite eminent Jewish leaders within the community doing incredible work for wider society. It is quite well noted, when you do speak to people that hold high office at different events, they do recognise that. And no one denies, if anything, they champion and they elevate the fact that Australian Jewry has contributed phenomenally to the tapestry of Australia and to every single facet of life here.
I was going to mention the fact that last week, the week before, the Australian published a whole list of Jewish people from the Holocaust Museum with their faces and what they believe that they stand up for the Jewish people and what they've done. And I think that we should do more in that publicity side of things. Paul, do you agree with that?
Does somebody want to respond?
My question was directed.
This will have to be our last question.
Hello? Yeah. As I've been listening to the questions and the answers. I thought my whole talk was pointless because really I'm overwhelmed by what I'm hearing. And what I'm hearing is direct connection between what happened in Israel and the Holocaust. It took me a while to start thinking about this almost automatic conjunction, okay? And I don't think that it's not understandable, because if you see something like that, well, what does it mean? And you look for the symbols. What does it symbolize? And it's almost inevitable to think, oh, well, okay, so this symbolizes the worst things that ever happened to us, and this is only a foretaste, or it's like a forespace, it's like an entree into something that's so familiar and so pervasive on our consciousness. And then I thought, well, actually, what was my paper about? And it was about fear, and the different kinds of fear, and the different kinds of fear that have led to anti-Semitism. But we're also not immune to fear and to exaggerate it. And there's some survival thing in there, because why should you wait for the bigger thing to happen when you can deal with the smaller thing maybe? So, and yet, not only, and because I immediately warned the chancellor by saying, listen, I know that some of you are even afraid to go into the street, okay? But it's not so bad. It's not good. But you've got to get the actual perspective, the reality of it. And fear of death is the biggest psychological survival instinct, if you like. And you don't like to wait for something bigger to occur. You remember, you think, oh, this triggers for me knowledge of other persecutions, of other deaths. Okay? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the fear of death. And it's very difficult to get that into perspective. In my talk I tried and said, well, there are all kinds of fears and all kinds of responses, and some can be good, but I've described all the bad ones. Not many finished up in the Holocaust. It's not likely that this will finish up in the Holocaust, but it's certainly reminiscent, and we have those responses as if. It's even harder to look at the triggers of what causes the fear. Who are these people and why? That's what I said right at the beginning. It takes, I wasn't, Viv knows, I didn't want to do this talk because to ask the question why, like Klausfeld said, you don't ask why, because then the perpetrators are starting to become human. And once they are human, they have their reasons. And you have to ask their reasons. I have personally actually asked demonstrators, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel demonstrators. I went up to them, I said, why? What are you doing here? What are your thoughts? Why? Where does it come from, etc. There's one particular person who's been marching with every pro-Palestinian march. I said, why are you doing this? I had discussions with him. So the point is, it's incumbent on us, I think, to ask the question why. If we are people of God, of humanity, once we acknowledge that others are human as well, we don't agree with them, we don't want them to do this, but we need to know why they are doing it in order to then be able to talk to them and prevent it happening. The funny thing is that a lot of the Palestinians have the same fears. They actually have fears. They also fear that they will be attacked. Their fears remind them of other fears. After all, they are here not because they enjoy being here, they are here because they're refugees. What has made them refugees? What are their fears and so on? So what I'm saying is, yes, acknowledge our fears, acknowledge this is unfair and all what happened, but at the same time, it's incumbent on us to try to understand and understand that this is a human problem. I mean, I'll just give you one example. This catch cry from the river to the sea. Okay, I actually asked one of these demonstrators, "What do you mean by from the river to the sea?" And she said, "Oh, Palestine for the Palestinians." I said, "Well, where should the Jews go?" Well, yeah, there should be a two-state solution. So it's a yeah. But what do some of our people say? From sea to the river, it's all ours. Okay, there are people like that as well. So the psychology of it is somewhere rather human, and we have to understand it.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you. I think we'll conclude it now. I'd like to say that perhaps the message could be that we should really dig deep to reset our Jewish pride in who we are and what we have contributed and achieved for all mankind. The ripple effect of our showing courage and standing up for our own people against anti-Semitic abuse will be our contribution to making a difference. So please thank all our speakers. Everybody coming, and Paul's books are there at the back, and if you've got time to grab some coffee, thank you again.
I'm not going to buy. Do you want to buy one of books?
Yeah. You want to go? And you want it now?
Yeah, I would. I really would.
Is this going to be available for us?
We will upload it. We've got a YouTube channel, so we'll be uploading it. Yep.
Because we'd love to, particularly Lisa, because I'm with Courage to
Yeah,
Care.
of course, I remember you. Yes.
We'd love to be able to share it as widely as we can.
I thought she's coming back here. She's not here. I need her to read me. Can I leave her a message?
I've got nothing to do with it. I keep telling you. I'm not part of the museum anymore.